The first thing I knew for certain was Mack's chin on my wrist. Not the smell of the ward, which was something like copper and dry grass, and not the low harmonic hum the Vethrani call ambient calibration, which sounds to human ears like a tuning fork dropped inside a cistern. Not the pain either, which was present but distant in the way pain gets when your body has decided to deal with it in shifts. The first thing was Mack, 12 years old, 28 pounds of Beagle, chin pressed to the inside of my left wrist with the kind of deliberate, applied weight that working dogs use when they want you to know they're paying attention. I was alive. That was the next thing I established. The ceiling above me was Vethrani ceramic, that blue-gray color they use on all their institutional surfaces, because it calms the neural activity of 7 out of their 11 client species. It did nothing for me. I turned my head and found Mack looking back. He wasn't wagging, he was still. That's how I knew the situation was not resolved. "Sir," the voice came from somewhere to my right, low, careful, the practiced cadence of someone who had delivered a great deal of bad news and had learned to space the syllables evenly. I turned. The speaker was a Vethrani orderly, slate purple, tall, the auxiliary limbs folded in the posture their manuals classify as neutral professional. "The animal needs to be relocated to the cargo hold. This is a medical space." "How many times have you tried?" I asked. A pause. "This would be the 4th attempt." "Right," I said. I closed my eyes for a moment. My ribs disagreed with breathing, but I did it anyway. "Leave him. Station protocol designates non-medical organisms. Leave him." The orderly left. I don't know if Mack acknowledged this. His chin never moved. I found out later, in pieces, what had happened in the 6 hours before I woke up. The explosion on Deck 7, a fuel coupling failure that the Vethrani maintenance log would classify, in their understated way, as a significant uncontrolled pressure event, had taken out 40 feet of corridor and 3 supply rooms, and me, who had been in the wrong place at the wrong time, with a manifest in one hand and Mack's leash in the other. Mack had walked out of it. I had not walked. Mack had found the nearest Vethrani emergency response team and done what search and rescue beagles do, which is indicate with their entire body that a person needs attention, and he had done this until someone followed him. They brought me to the triage ward on Deck 4. They ran the initial assessments. The Vethrani clinical system, which they call the Tholen Biological Database, a catalog of physiological parameters for every species they have treated in the past 400 years, returned a verdict within 22 minutes of my arrival. Class 1 biological parameters, non-viable for continued intervention. I did not know this at the time. I was unconscious. Mack knew, in the way dogs know things, not from the database, but from the information available through his nose, and his attention, and 12 years of working beside a body that he had, evidently, decided was his business. He sat down beside the treatment table and put his chin on my wrist, and declined to go anywhere. The orderly's 4th attempt had been the last one they tried without authorization. The 5th required the supervising clinician on duty, a Tholesi physician named Orvith Suin, who was on rotation through the ward that week, and who had a reputation, I was told later, for treating the Tholen database as a closed argument. He came in, looked at Mack, looked at me, looked at Mack again. "The database has rendered a non-viability assessment," he said. Not to me. I was still under. To the attending medic, a young Vethrani, with the wide pupils look of someone watching something they had no category for. "The animal needs to be removed. It is a vector risk and a psychological liability for other patients." The attending medic, whose name I later learned was Tess Orval, said, "Sir, his readings change when the animal makes contact." Sufan looked at her, then at the monitor, then at Mack. Mack's chin was on my wrist. The trace on the monitor was doing something the database had not predicted. "The database," Suan said, "does not typically incorporate animal contact as a variable." "No, sir." A pause. The ward hummed. Mack breathed, slow and even, the way he always breathed when he was working. "Run the secondary cardiac trace," Suan said. It came back different from the primary. Not by a large margin. Enough. What happened between that moment and the order to stand down took another 40 minutes. The animal restraint team, 2 Vethrani handlers with a containment carrier designed for large quadrupeds arrived, assessed Mack, and made their first professional attempt. Mack looked at them. He did not growl, did not move, did not shift his chin from my wrist. He simply looked at them with the soft, unhurried attention of an animal that has dealt with worse and is not impressed. The senior handler later noted in his incident report that the animal had displayed no aggression, but that relocating it had proven, in his language, structurally inadvisable. This was a careful way of saying the dog had made clear, without any noise, that the people in the room were the ones who needed to move. They moved. Sushin ordered the animal restraint team to stand down and sent a query to the database for a manual review flag on my file. The database returned an automated response, noting that the non-viability assessment had already been confirmed by 2 independent algorithmic passes, and that manual review was typically reserved for ambiguous cases. Suin sent a second query, requesting the protocol for cases in which a concurrent biological assessor's data contradicted the primary result. The database returned. No concurrent biological assessor present. Patient file indicates a non-medical organism on premises. Please initiate relocation protocol. Suin closed the query window. He flagged the file as ambiguous anyway. This is what I was told. I was not present for any of it. I was lying on a table in a Vethrani triage ward with an old Beagle's chin on my wrist, and according to every clinical instrument in the room, I was gradually doing something that the database had determined I should not be capable of doing. Mack had opinions about that. I came back to full awareness around the 3rd hour. The pain had reorganized itself into something more specific by then: 3 cracked ribs on the right side, a pressure fracture in the left forearm, and a moderate concussion that had the quality of a tide coming in and going out. My vision cleared in stages: the ceiling, the walls, the monitor beside the table, with its columns of Vethrani script that I could read, slowly, if I had time and motivation. I had motivation. Non-viability assessment, manual review in progress. "Hey," I said. My voice came out like gravel on a dry road. Mack's tail moved, not a full wag, just a slow, deliberate acknowledgement. "I'm here. I know. Don't get up." I didn't get up. Tess Orval appeared at my left side within 30 seconds, moving with the practiced efficiency of someone who had been watching for that specific moment. She ran a quick set of checks, responded to my answers about pain, orientation, date and time, with the focused attention of a professional making notes. Then she said, with the neutrality of someone reporting a fact, "Your dog refused relocation 4 times. "That sounds right," I said. "The supervising physician wants to speak with you when you're stable." "I imagine he does." Suchan came in an hour later, when the ward had shifted from whatever the Vethrani call the morning protocols to whatever they call midday. He stood at the foot of the table and looked at Mack, who was now curled against my legs with his chin still pointed in my general direction, and then at me. "The database," he said, "assessed you as non-viable at the 60-minute mark." I understood that from the monitor. "You can read Vethrani clinical script?" I was a SAR handler for 31 years. I learned enough to read a status board. He absorbed this. The Thalessi have a way of processing information that looks, to a human observer, like stillness. They slow down, not because they're uncertain, but because they're being careful. He was being careful now. "Your dog," he said, "appears to have produced a consistent physiological change in your cardiac trace on each occasion of direct contact." We ran 5 assessments over the course of 3 hours. Each returned a result that contradicted the initial non-viability classification. The final assessment cleared you for continued intervention. "Good assessment," I said. The database had no variable accounting for the animal's input. "The database," I said, "doesn't know Mack." Suan looked at the Beagle for a long moment. Mack looked back. He had the expression he always had, the soft, slightly unfocused eyes that looked drowsy to people who didn't know him, and were, to people who did, a form of absolute attention. He had been trained, over 12 years, to find human life in collapsed buildings and flooded culverts, and the dense underbrush of 6 different continents. He had a nose that could distinguish a living person from a recently dead one from 50 meters in a crosswind. He knew what viable looked like. He knew what not viable looked like. He had looked at me and made a determination, and he had communicated that determination to everyone in the room by the simple method of not moving. He was a working animal, Suan said. It came out as a question that wasn't quite a question. Still is, I said. He's just old. His certification. Retired, but you don't retire the nose. Susun nodded, very slowly. He had the look of a man recalibrating a model he'd been using for a long time. I knew that look. I'd seen it on faces of species I could count on 2 hands, across 3 decades of work, in places that didn't always want humans in them. It is the look that appears when the category a person has been using turns out to be too small. I would like, he said, to make a notation in your file. Noting what? That the patient's earth-working animal provided a concurrent vital sign assessment that identified survival indicators the primary diagnostic system had closed. And that relocation of the animal during this period would have resulted in the loss of that assessment input. I looked at Mack. Mack had closed his eyes, the way he did when a situation was resolved and he was no longer needed to hold it together. His breathing was slow. His tail moved once, against the table surface, and went still. You can make that notation, I said. Suan did more than make the notation. I found this out 2 days later, when Tess Orval came in to do the morning check, and mentioned, with the careful neutrality she used when delivering information she considered significant, but wasn't certain how I'd receive it. The chief physician has submitted a protocol amendment. Attending earth-working animals, SAR dogs, service animals, certified handlers partners, are to be classified as medical personnel on station during active patient contact, not removed, not logged as a vector risk, assigned a personnel designation, and noted in the patient file as a concurrent assessor. I sat with that for a moment. They're assigning dogs a personnel designation, I said. The amendment uses the term specialist biological assessor, she said. There will be a badge category. I looked at Mack, who was asleep on the foot of the bed by then, his gray muzzle resting on his paws. His ears dropped in the relaxed position that meant he had decided the room was safe and the people in it were accounted for. He had been asleep for most of the last day. He had earned it. He had sat beside a table in a Vethrani triage ward and pressed his chin to my wrist and told a database, in the only language available to him, that it was wrong. He had done this 4 times before anyone listened. He had done it a 5th time for good measure. He had not growled, not paced, not made any noise at all. He had simply sat there with the authority of an animal that knows what it knows and has known it longer than any database in the room, and waited for the people around him to catch up. The Vethrani would put his name in a protocol amendment. They would give him a badge designation. They would, I imagined, include him in some future version of the Tholen database as a variable the primary assessment system had failed to account for. Mack would sleep through all of it. That seemed right to me. He had done the work. He was entitled to the rest. Tell the chief physician, I said, that I'll sign whatever he needs. Tess Orval made a note. At the foot of the bed, Mack's ear twitched once. Some dream, or some sound the room made that I couldn't hear, and then went still again. His breathing was slow and even. The monitor beside my bed showed a trace the database had once called impossible. I let him sleep.